topic we discuss tonight on the basis of our usual format, namely three questions asked by the moderator, who is Francesco Pinzin from the Goethe University of Frankfurt, is voice, an intricate and intriguing topic on which the two discussants will give us their opinion. As usual, for security reasons, the chat, microphone, and screen sharing functions will be disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write if you intend to ask a question, and we will enable your microphone. Those of you who won't be able to ask their questions can send it to me via email to the following address, ceciliapoletto@gmail.com. I will collect the questions also from YouTube and send them to the speakers for the later reply. This linguistic flash mob is the last one on a syntactic topic for this term. Our next linguistic flash mob in June, before the summer pause, will be on heritage language. Now I leave the floor to tonight's moderator.
Thank you, Cecilia. And I also wanted to very briefly thank the whole organizing committee for letting me moderate these two amazing scholars on this topic, which has always been of extreme interest to me, but I'm pretty sure not only to me. Today, similarly to what we did last time, we are going to discuss a rather traditional topic in morphosyntactic studies, that is the concept of voice. This concept has ancient roots in the grammatical tradition, which date back at least to Greek and Latin grammarians. But clearly, don't worry, I'm not going to go through all the possible definitions of this concept. But summarizing, however, and adopting somehow a more modern perspective, we could say that today we will discuss the typology of external arguments, their definitions, and the different ways in which natural languages tamper with their morphosyntactic representation. In other words, we will discover how differently or similarly, depending on your theoretical stand, our languages deal with agents, causers, experiencers, and how our languages signal their realization in specific derivations, as for example, actives, passives, midos, anticausatives, and so on. One of the very interesting things about this topic is that it is not only constrained to the pure definition of the typology of external arguments and their realization, but it also extends beyond these boundaries, as it is interestingly interrelated with the realization of other grammatical categories. This is so because it is at the crossroad, we could say, between what we usually call the argument structure field or inner aspect, axioms art, and the field in which outer aspectual categories are encoded. But enough with these preliminary notes, as I'm pretty sure our guests will be way more precise than I could ever be, and will have a lot of more interesting things to tell us. As you already know, and Cecilia said it to you before, our two discussants for today will be Artemis Alexiadou from the Humboldt University of Berlin and Adriana Belletti from the University of Siena and Geneva. They both extensively worked on voice phenomena, and interestingly, both Artemis and Adriana worked the theoretical and the empirical side of this phenomena, pairing in an insightful way general analysis with the precise studies on different populations, such as children acquiring first language, bilinguals, heritage speakers, and other types of populations. This consequently enables them to take a wider and richer view on this subject, which we will enjoy today. Since we are all eager to listen to what they will tell us, I will now leave the floor to them, presenting the first question, which hits the problem of the systemization of voice phenomena within a constrained morphosyntactic model. So this is the question: how does voice phrase capture the typology of voice distinctions? And I leave the floor, if I'm not mistaken, to Artemis, which will go first on this question. Please, you can share the screen if you want.
Yes, thank you, Francesco, and thank you, Cecilia, for having me here. I'm looking forward to discussing these issues with Adriana and all of you later on. And I hope that, no, it doesn't let me share.
Probably,
no. Can you see now?
Yes, you
Yes.
can.
Okay, thank you. So I begin with a couple of remarks as a background. The voice as a functional projection in an extended functional sequence was introduced in late 80s, beginning of the 90s by Maria Luisa Rivero on the basis of Greek and Albanian data, who proposed that voice has its own projection in the syntax and is adjacent to the verb phrase that has argument structure. And cross-linguistically, we know that voice is very low in the functional hierarchy along the lines of the representation that you see in 1. And this relates to Francesco's point with interaction between properties of actions, art, and higher properties. Kreitzer in '96, building among other things on observation by Alec Marantz, who pointed out that the thematic role of the external argument is actually calculated on the basis of the combination of a verb and its object. So throw a party and throw a fit involve a combination of a verb and a noun phrase, and this determines the thematic role of the subject, proposed that external arguments are introduced by voice. Which leads me to the so-called voice hypothesis, according to which voice is responsible for the introduction of external arguments, and the same head that introduces a DP in the active licenses a prepositional phrase in the past. Now, for several people, this voice phrase is unlike the little VP assuming standard minimalism. And there were several arguments that were put forth that voice and little VP are not the same head. Most importantly, some of these depend on the combination of voice morphology with verbalizing morphology, suggesting that these two heads are distinct. If we focus on change of state verbs, then the complex of a VP phrase together with a result phrase is taken to introduce a causative sum component, leading to the hierarchy that we see in 3, where voice introduces the external argument, and then what is below voice introduces a causative sum component. Now, with respect to your question, how does voice phrase capture voice distinctions? Active and passive versus passive is taken to be the prototypical alternation. However, we know that not all languages have passives, and moreover, passives are not alike or equally productive across languages. And more importantly, and this has been the focus of my work, in several languages, a number of other alternations cluster under the same voice marking. And this clustering phenomenon is a case of voice syncretism, where you have at least the 4 alternations that you see in 4 bearing the same morphology, for example, in Greek, being realized with non-active morphology. So passives, this case is the synthetic passive, dispositional middles, anti-causatives, but also reflexives and reciprocals are all clustered under the same voice marking. One way to deal with this clustering was to try and identify the unifying property that these configurations all share. And it has been argued that the property that they share is that they all lack a specifier in voice. So they lack the projection of the external argument. And a way to capture precisely the absence of this external argument in voice is to formulate a rule as in 5, which is taken from Empik's work, where basically one can argue that in languages like Greek, the voice is spelled out as non-active when there is no specifier. And there are various different other ways to encode this, basically trying to identify the unifying property that all these configurations share. Now, looking more into the ways passive formation differs across languages, And having in mind that on the one hand, we have languages like Greek, where several alternations cluster under the same marking. And on the other hand, we have languages like English when this is not the case. A more differentiated typology of voice emerged, according to which in Greek type languages, there is one voice head that is responsible for all alternations, which was labeled middle. But in languages like English, there is a dedicated passive head, which is there for the purposes of passive formation, that takes a voice phrase containing, that takes the voice phrase as its complement. But there are some differences between middle and passives that this view explains. The first one is the disjointness, the fact that in the passive, we always understand that there's an implicit external argument. And this is dealt with assuming that the passive imposes an extensional quantification over the open argument before voice projects the external argument. However, in middle voice systems, the structure that you have can be interpreted as passive, reflexive, or anti-causative, depending on the combination that it finds itself in, depending on the VP complex it combines with. And the second difference has to do with the productivity. So systems that have a middle voice show restrictions with respect to passive formation. And naturally, English type languages also have the other alternations that I mentioned before. It's just that they don't cluster under the same morphology, and they may employ further structures to encode them. So for example, they may form anti-causatives without voice. They may form middles as projecting the argument in specifier of voice, and they have reflexives as transitive structures. And naturally, this is one kind of way of going about it. There are other ways that include different typologies of voice. And of course, there are other syntactic alternatives that do not implicate voice, at least for the passive. Thank you.
Thank you, wonderful. And now I think it's the turn of Adriana Belletti. You can share the screen.
Yes. So I should start saying that I tend to think syntactically, to paraphrase the title of a nice book of a friend, Liliane Hagemann. So my interpretation of what voice amounts to is maybe traditional one, and it amounts to a syntactic position in the syntactic structure, and in particular, it amounts to some position in the functional spine of the clause, low, as Artemis was saying, in the structure, as again often assumed, around the descriptive part of the clause, which is the VP, small VP, say. So voice can have some morphological manifestation depending on the morphological properties of the language. It may affect the verbal morphology or part of it, but it most has an effect on the distribution of the argument in the end, on the grammatical functions that they assume. But not just arguments, also other parts of the structure. So the order of the grammatical functions of the arguments of the verb, or other chunks of structure. So that's essentially the idea. Now let me start with the presentation. So starting from this idea, voice has no, the way I see it, has no implication in theta rho assignment. So I will start. This is a slide I show to my students in general. So with the idea that there are essentially three main verb classes, three verb classes, in fact. So on the one side, transitive and anergatives or intransitives, which are essentially the same. And what is singled out is anaccusatives, which are singled out precisely by the fact that they don't have an external argument. Okay, and they don't because they lack the small v layer. So now, in contrast, transitive verbs have external argument, and they also have the external argument in the passive voice. Okay, so we know that this is the case because we interpret the external argument as Artemis also said, but we know that this external argument is indeed syntactically active in both binding and control. So here are some examples from Italian or from English from some recent paper by Chris. So this view of voice puts me together with a number of scholars, including my close colleague, Chris Collins, with whom we have worked on smuggling and syntax, to which I'll come back later on. And maybe it's a bit different from the standard Artemis just described. Now, something I want to address here with this view, say more syntactic view of voice or morphosyntactic view of voice, is the idea that voice can have effect on different positions. So maybe voice is one position, but it has effect on other position of the closed structure. And I want to illustrate that with an example from Italian, which I think is interesting, and it has to do with the active comparison between active and passive voice with respect to the position of the past participle. Now, the past participle has exactly the same position, as exactly the same morphological realization, both active and passive. However, in active, it fills a certain position. It can be in a higher, say, position, thinking of it in terms of head movement, for instance, and in passive it can remain lower. So we can identify the active voice here. I do identify it with a case, just to be concrete. So say accusative, and this active voice is in relation with small v and ultimately becomes responsible of assignment of case to the object. So this is a bit in the classical agro-O idea. And in the active voice, then the external argument raises to the subject position. So in a kind of traditional Larsonian type structure we are familiar with. Now the passive instead will have in Collins' terms, by as one of its components. So essentially the parallel of the accusative is the by phrase, is the by had. And this by, that's the effect of the voice here, does not enter in relation with small v, but rather is a case assigner. And it is a case assigner to the external argument. Then something else happens here, and this is the attraction of the past participle into the subject position. Now, into, sorry, the specifier of by, or the voice position. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, the fact of the matter is that the past participle in the active can go higher than the past participle in the passive, as we see here, with respect to low adverbs of Cinque's hierarchy, and with respect to the quantifiers like all that move in syntax in Italian and French and so on. So we can think that as an effect of the presence of the active or passive voice, the past participle either goes to reach a higher, say, a spectral position, or remains lower. So that's it for my first 5 minutes.
Perfect. And I think you can leave your screen on, because the second question will start with you. Yes. just.
Ah.
And the second question,
That's true.
which reads, how do you formalize the differences between agent and cause? And the floor is yours.
Yes. Cause or causer. Okay. So I thought I would, so let me look at the time. Yes, I thought I would address this by having the following consideration. First, and illustrate it with the causative, the syntactic causative of the Italian French type, familiar, fare a, faire a. So we can think that within, again, the functional spine, but this time even lower, so within the small v spine, we can find the expression of voice, and one such case would be the causative voice. So this is an example of a causative with fare in Italian, fare a for that matter, but that's not crucial. So here is the structure I'm assuming. So here we have the lexical, the projection of the lexical verb, say eat here, with its own external argument, say the agent. And then in the verbal spine, so there's a light verb, very familiar light verb idea, we have the verb fare, so make. Make is a same, in this view, is a kind of semi-functional verb that assigns a kind of designated, it has a reduced argument structure with an external role, an external argument. So here, Maria, to which a role is attributed, which I identify with the initiator role a la Ramchan, Legate, and many people. Okay, so as for well, this semi-functional verb is selected by the causative voice, and by virtue of this position and of this selection relation, it gets the causative interpretation of value. Okay, now as for the question of agent and cause or initiator in the terms I prefer to, the terminology I prefer to adopt, these are two theta roles, okay? One assigned by the lexical verb, here mangiare, and one assigned, so in the specifier, in the highest specifier of the lexical projection, and the initiator instead as the external theta role of the functional verb, of the light verb, okay? So in this sense, they are two independent theta roles. Okay, then something more happens here, and it's the attraction of the verbal chunk into the specifier of the causative head. So is this something that only concerns Italian or French or Romance and so on? So in part it is, in part it isn't, and here comes the idea that a verb like light verbs like fare or make enter the same kind of structure. So make enters exactly the same type of structure as as Italian fare. The only difference is absence of the dative marker, which is probably a manifestation again of the light verb spine, because as Kane has shown very clearly, two is different from I in French, for instance, and similarly in Italian. So apart from that, the same functional spine is present in both. The only difference is that the verbal chunk is attracted into the specifier of the causative head in Italian type causative, whereas the external argument is attracted into the specifier of the causative voice in English type causatives. Now, this can be phrased in terms of the labeling algorithm, and the idea being that in the situation of phrase-phrase merge, either the external argument raises, and that's the English type, or the VP raises. So there is a kind of causative parameter that that takes care of that. And as for Romance, this is essentially the traditional analysis that goes back to Kane 75, that this type of causatives involve a VP proposing operation. And the idea here is that this proposing is a property of the causative voice, is triggered by that. And this is just another illustration, before I end my 5 minutes, of another manifestation of voice within the verbal spine. So the small v spine, and this is Chris Conlin's analysis of the dative alternation. We're starting from John gave Mary the car order, presence of a voice that matches in the passive type computation here too, attracts the chunk. So and then other things happen, but the core of the idea is the same in all these types of derivation, to which I'll come back later again. Okay. I hope I was good.
Perfect. Thank you also for the timing, perfect timing. And now we can go to the third question. Oh no, sorry. Mistake.
I have to say
Yes.
something about this.
Sorry.
Now,
I jumped ahead.
Sorry.
Sorry for that.
No problem.
Artemis, it's your turn.
Right. So I will agree with Adriana that agent and cause or causer are different things, let's say. But my motivation for saying so is slightly different, as you might expect. And it sort of centers around the observation that we see here in the data in 8. So when you have transitive causative verbs, they are known to take both agent and causer subjects. But once you form the anti-causative of break here, they allow only a modification by causer PPs and not modification by phrase. Okay. So data like this, we took them in joint work with Elena Nagnostopoulou and Florian Schäfer to suggest that it shows that the anti-causative break also has a causative component. But importantly, it shows that somehow agents and causers are different, so that it cannot be the same position that introduces both. And there are other people in the literature that have noted that agents are different from causers. So, for example, one citation here from Levin and Rappaport is that causers correspond to the entire causing sub-event, or Lina Pilkinen saying that a causer does not name a participant of the causing event, but rather names the causing event itself. So there's something fundamentally different between agent and causers. So naturally, there are different ways in which one can go about representing agent and causers in the syntax. One way is to call them both initiators. So from that perspective, it doesn't really matter. They are in the same position. Another view is to say, well, they're different, and the difference is that they're introduced by different heads. So the flavors of the idea. So agents are introduced by a V do, and causers are introduced by a V cause. A further idea is to have a particular voice head along the lines, not quite the same, but along the lines of what Adriana was saying. So we have voice agent for agents and voice holder that appears in stative predicates. So we might also have a voice cause head. And a further option is to say, well, they are different in the sense that they're introduced in different parts of the spine. Agents are in voice and causers are in the VP. And that is from the perspective of the prepositional phrase that we saw before. So we saw that they are there with anticausatives as prepositional phrases, as modifiers. So if these are licensed as modifiers by the causative sub-event, then they might always be related to this causative sub-event and not to the head introducing the external argument, namely voice. And perhaps they're introduced as PP adjuncts. Now, this is actually quite interesting once you start looking at languages like Japanese, where the causal argument can never be introduced as a DP. So when we have the counterpart break in Japanese, this can appear as only as having an adjunctive subject. And if we want to have a causal subject, this has to be introduced as a modifier. And there might be at least two more reasons suggesting that we need to have some differentiation in our syntax for cause as opposed to agent. The first one has to do with an observation made in the literature that we have verbs like rust that are labeled internally cause change of state verbs, which normally do not undergo the causative alternation. So they normally appear as intransitive verbs. However, it was noticed that they are possible intransitive construals, but only when they have causal subjects and not agent subjects. So salt air rusted the metal pipes and not John rusted the metal pipes. And the property that they do not co-occur with agents correlates with the fact that most of these verbs also do not undergo passivization. So that makes an analysis of causals as being subjects, low subjects, as opposed to high subjects, agents in voice, attractive, at least in my view. And a second reason why we would want to differentiate causals from agents has to do with observations that when you have like consumption verbs like eat, they typically do not combine with causals. But when they are part of a resultative construction, so when a particle is there, eat away, the presence of a causal is possible. And the second observation is that causals, unlike agents, give rise to culmination entailments. So being chosen last insulted Mary, it seems unnatural to follow, but she didn't take to heart at all. Okay, so these are two reasons as to why we want to have a different representation of causals as opposed to agents. This brings me to my end of these 5 minutes.
Thank you, and perfect timing. And now we can go to the final question, which I was so eager to listen something about before. And Artemis, you start this last question.
Yes,
which
so
reads, just 1 second, which is rather a topic to discuss than an actual question, that is relating passives and causative structures. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for this question. So it has been noted in the literature that at least the way I will approach your question will be precisely from this observation that you have across languages causative constructions that may have a passive meaning. And we have here examples from French, English. And one such construction is, for example, the get passive, where you have a verb that as a transitive is causative, and this can appear in a passive construal. And the typological work on this correlation has identified it in many different languages and suggested that this passive causative correlation maybe has an intermediate or reflexive causative form, which makes it very interesting for the kind of things I was talking in the first part of your questions. But now, importantly, if the two causative and passive structures are somehow related, then from my perspective, if we build causatives and if we build passives in the syntax, then we have to include the same building blocks for both. Okay. So one way to do the get passive, which is has been discussed a lot in the literature, is to say, well, the get passive is basically involves an anti-causative get. So Mary got John arrested, John got arrested. This is the anti-causative get, which embeds a passive structure. So, and people don't always agree as to whether the complement of get is passive or verbal passive or adjectival passive. But one way to get the passive meaning of a causative component is to think that they're built in the syntax. You have a causative verb that becomes anti-causative and combines with a passive. And you can conceptualize the reflexive causative that has been noted in the literature as basically being an anti-causative carrying this special reflexive marking that we talked about in the first part. Now, the more interesting thing, at least for me, and in relation to this question, comes from morphology, and this is an observation that you have languages where the same morpheme, the same marker, is used both for passive and causative, and also maybe anti-causative. Okay. So maybe that you find the same morpheme for passive and anti-causative is not so surprising, but you also, that the fact that you find it also in the causative is quite surprising. So there are some data here for Edenki, if I pronounce it correctly, where is this, we see this marker that is marked bold here, that appears both in passive interpretations, but also in causative interpretations. And in languages like Korean, where you have 4 passive morphemes, these can all be used in causative constructions. If you look at the right column, yes, it's my right, so my right. The combination of a particular verb with one of these elements can be interpreted both as passive and as causative. And in Altaic languages, this is actually quite systematic that you find this kind of morphology. So one possibility that can be entertained is to view this type of polysemy as part of the clustering phenomenon that I mentioned in the first part. And it's interesting that you find this kind of clustering with synthetic morphology and not with analytic morphology. So one can think of a syntactic derivation in which you have a pass head, a close head that merges with a VP. We will see that in a moment. And in analytic constructions, the pass cause head is separated by the lower VP, which constitutes a phasal domain. But in synthetic constructions, we have head movement, as we see here. So here we have head movement, and the creation of the head movement gives you one domain, and then the lower VP is no longer a phase. So here we have a phasal domain, an analytic construction, and here we have a synthetic formation where basically the two heads had collapsed into one. And now we can relate this availability of several interpretations precisely by looking at the domain in which they appear. They appear in synthetic constructions, which are derived in the syntax. And from that perspective, we can treat this head as allosomous in the sense of Marantz, and that is, it gets an interpretation and gets depending on the properties of the PEP it combines with. And on the contrary, analytic passives or causatives never have additional interpretations. Related to that is the observation that the synthetic passive, at least in Korean, is argued not to be productive, while the analytic passive is productive, which again correlates with the domain of their formation and is similar to the clustering cases we saw in the first part, which I described under the label of middle voice. And this brings me to the end of these 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. And Adriana, you can take the question. We cannot hear you. You're muted.
Good. It disappeared because when you have the presentation, things are different. Okay, so let me address this issue of the relation between causative and passive from the perspective of what I said before, which has been in a way enriched by what Artemis just said, but showing that in cross-linguistically we see that these two voices are related in ways that may even be lead to syncretism, which is quite interesting. So in the type of analysis I hinted at before, we had a movement, a crucial step was this movement of a chunk of the verb phrase attracted by the voice head, passive, or the causative one. Now, the main point here is that which portion, which chunk exactly, and where this chunk goes, it all depends on the type of voice we are dealing with. So either in the case that we have seen, either the passive or the causative. Then there are further processes, maybe case related ones leading to promotion of the subject, of the internal argument into subject position. But now I want to rather focus on the strict interaction between passive and causative by illustrating again with Italian, but it's the se faire that was mentioned already in French, which works exactly the same way, combining ingredients of the computation involved in both passive and causatives, which may suggest why they are so strictly connected. Now, first step in passive, the smuggling step, we have the attraction of the past participle phrase into attracted by the passive voice. So that's the smuggling step of the derivation. Now, by, as I said before, is responsible for the case of on the external argument. Now, interestingly, it does not affect the interpretation. So this is something I care about. It relates also to the previous to question 2, because we tend to call it the agent phrase, but the by phrase is not necessarily an agent at all. So a crucial property of passive is the fact that the same theta role that the by phrase hold in passive is the one that it's expressed by the external argument in the active. So by is a kind of executive preposition in this respect. Okay, so once this past participle is moved into the specifier of by, we have the raising of the smuggled object into the subject position. So that's derivation of passive. Now in causatives, we have seen that we have this movement already. Here the attractor is the causative voice, and here the chunk is now the past participle is the infinitival verb and the object. Now, differently from the passive derivation, here we don't necessarily have the movement of the internal argument, but we can maybe under criticization as we have here, but it's not a property because case properties do not lead to that necessity, say. This is the final doubt that I won't say anything about. It's just assuming it's essentially the same, except that maybe one thing I say that it has an ingredient of the passive voice in the presence of a by type preposition here, by that in Italian. However, interestingly, this is another case of affected distance of the voice, if you want, by virtue of being in the selective spine of the causative head. The by phrase of the causative is not the same as it's not the same expletive type by phrase that we see in passive, but it has a more agentive type or interpretation. So that's an interesting distinction, but just a side remark. And here we go to the C causative passive. I illustrate with Italian again. So il bambino si fa pettinare dalla mamma. Now, we see this C, so the reflexive impersonal, which is something that we often see cross-linguistically as present in passive type constructions. But here, and I think that there are instances of reflexive passive in some cases, also in Italian. I won't talk about them now. However, C here has is the initiator, so it's in this of the causative of the light verb fare, which is embedded under the causative voice. Then we have attraction into the specifier. Then C has its own syntax. So in that respect, it's a kind of morphological passivizer in that it's blocks, say, the assignment of the accusative, and then we have the raising of the internal argument into the subject position. Then there are other processes going on. In the end, C is a kind of subject clitics, so it will go higher in the structure, and then by, it's a well-behaved by in the same type of analysis I already discussed. Now, is this something that only happens in romance? No, it's something that we find. Passive has been discussed already, I mean, talked about already, and we can assume exactly the same derivation here, with the same chunk being attracted by the same causative head, with the difference that we have no overt expression of the external argument, at least no overt expression. I like to end my 5 minutes now with data from development, which I've been talking about in various occasions, but I think they are inspiring because something we found repeatedly and in a robust way in elicited production when we were eliciting some object dependencies in clinical dislocation of object relatives in the passive or trying to elicit the passive with young children. What we got were, when we did have a passive, were passive of a particular kind, and in particular they were passive of the causative type. Okay, so these are two very different and independent experiments, but the same shape of result is obtained as far as the type of passive produced by children, young children, so up to 5 is so the kind of passive produced. So there is a preference, we can say, for the C causative passive stages. Maybe there is a root to that with a reflexive type passive, but then when it's a real passive, also in the target language, this is the one that comes first. So this indicates a kind of early access to this derivation that combines ingredients of passive and causative voices, in particular their effect on the distribution of arguments and chunks of the structure. This preference, I have some ideas, I have to stop for my 5 minutes, but clearly the passive and the causatives, that's the main insight, and I think that this acquisition data show us that they should share some fundamental crucial ingredients, and the hypothesis is that they share crucial derivational mechanisms in terms of what their respective voices do. Okay, so they are in tight relation. Okay.
Thank you, perfect. And thank you for the extremely insightful presentations. Now, I think the floor is open for questions, and you can post them in the chat or just put in the chat the fact that you want. I already see here Kenneth Safari that has a question, and if we can unmute him.
Yeah, hi. I have a question for Adriana. Just a kind of a puzzle that maybe you have already an answer for. In your analysis and Chris's of the dative constructions, you move the direct object and verb higher and to a position where that phrase C commands the dative, right? Is that a correct analysis? Is that a correct? Yeah. So I was wondering what the C command relations were, because I mean, you don't get things. Let's say I tried to write something out here. So imagine that the queen decides all marriages in this society. The queen gave them to each other, but you don't get the queen gave each other to them.
I think this is a question for Chris. This was just by illustration of another instance of internal, but in Chris's analysis, then the object is shifted, say, necessarily higher.
Okay. All right. Well, that's simple.
Yeah.
The second question now it's from Julie Legate.
Hi, this question is also about this smuggling analysis of passives. So I think by now there's a lot of evidence that for at least some languages that the external argument of the passive cannot be syntactically projected. So I argued that, for example, for Chinese and related languages in my book, and then Milena, who might be here, and Farouk, and I also had a language paper with extensive argumentation for Lithuanian and for Turkish. And so I'm wondering if you think that this is a point of variation where languages can behave differently in this respect, or what your thoughts are on that.
I guess I should answer.
I could, I don't know. I mean,
Yes.
I think what I said are more in line with what Julie has in mind. So I think it's for the smuggling approach.
Yes, well, there are different types of answers to this type of question. And it is that maybe we call passive. We use this as if we knew what passive is. Constructions comes with a label. Maybe it's up that it's a number of ingredients. Okay, so so that's a short answer. So it could be that there are constructions that involve a morphology that it's related, like the reflexive, say, and this is really happening cross-linguistically a lot, to structures that would amount to a well-behaved passive in the way we are used to. But there are others in which we see the same morphology and no, for instance, no external argument ever. So this would be like the unaccusative type structures, but we know that there are structures of this type, that there are verb verbs of this type that even in I mean, familiar, say, type of languages where you have a morphology and there never was an external argument. So this is an interesting issue. So real unaccusatives with some morphology that looks like it. So a reflexive and in some respect like a passive. So I think that a passive is a covert term for maybe that there is a core and then there are more peripheral type constructions. But I think that what the main insight that really I find convincing of the, say, call it the smuggling analysis, is that in the core cases, say, of passive, in which you interpret this external argument, which is there in the active, and you interpret it also in the passive, you see its activity also in syntax. Okay, so in it's syntactic.
So I think these are exactly the places where you don't see it. So the cases that I'm talking about are indeed distinct from the unaccusatives. I think it's also notable that, you know, you're citing these English examples of reflexive binding. I think it's quite notable that these are only generic, and we see basically the same 3 examples being cited over and over, and you can't produce more.
No, wait, but that's precisely the point. So just to conclude the answer, let's say this kind of core cases. So in these cases, you don't have to add anything to why you interpret this argument. This argument is there because it's always been there, okay, in exactly the same way in the active or in the passive. So you don't have to add anything when you have a biphrase, for instance. So when you have a biphrase, how come this biphrase is exactly like the one you have in the active as a subject? Okay, so these are all things that you just have for free. If it's an adjunct, you have to start, you have to add some further reasons for that. So I think that that's an important insight. The generic story is also interesting, actually, because it has to do with those cases in which the external argument is silent. And so when it is silent, you may imagine that it is a kind of impoverished argument, like a generic, because that's exactly the same that you have in Italian, when you have the implicit argument. The implicit argument is like an arbitrary type of subject, and you have agreement phenomena that show you that this is the generic. So if it's silent, it can't be something specific. I don't know if I'm clear on that. As for the cases in which you never had an external argument, but it's not an accusative, why is it not an accusative?
Because it's semantically, there's an implicit agent, just like in other passives. So you can have a biphrase, and if you don't, then it's either existential or generic, interpreted agentively.
Okay, so maybe this needs to be understood, but I don't think that this kills the smuggling approach, because the insights that you have with the idea of not having to add anything to the argument structure, to what pertains to the argument structures when you have the active passive alternation, I think it's an important insight. And so I would like to stick to it.
I don't know if Artemis wants to.
Right. I mean, I think I obviously I cannot say how the smuggling analysis would deal with that. but in a sense, I was looking also at languages or data from languages showing that, at least in some passives, that you have no evidence that there is an external argument projected in the syntax. So the view that says that there is something implicit there that actually is not syntactically realized is, I guess, in line with the data I was dealing with. Okay. And then you go into the existential quantification, as was mentioned by Julie, or, you know, but then you have no evidence from all sorts of tests that an external argument is projected in the syntax.
Now I think it's, if I can go on in the interest of time, because we have other questions, it's the turn of Carmen Soran. You can unmute yourself, I think.
Okay. Okay, I can't very well manage. So in part, my question is technological, and in that sense, it is not very interesting. However, since we are here to talk about what voice means, I think that is important. And I also think that by the examples that we had today, there was a lot of different uses of this term, just you know, both for Artemis and for Adriana. And I think that it would be really interesting to try to sort this out somehow. Just to, so it's not a, you know, to start with, at least, it's not a very interesting question. However, as soon as we start thinking about it, we call voice, on the one hand, following Kratzer, the introduction of the external argument. On the other hand, as a matter of fact, Kratzer herself, for Kratzer, little v would have been as good. So it is not due to Kratzer or Maranzi's arguments that we need to introduce voice per se, but little v was perfectly sufficient for that purposes, and it was even probably less problematic in a sense, because then we knew precisely that little v of active voice could introduce the external argument in an argument. Now, so fine. So this is one use. But then there was the use of voice corresponding to voice marking. And this is something completely different in that respect. Yes, indeed, we want to distinguish between active and non-active voice in languages, or non-active being like middle in languages like Greek. But then that's a completely different voice. And maybe we would be better off with something like little v. Now, if we come to little v, we may wonder whether something like active versus minus active would be something that we expect as a specification of little v, or instead we would have maybe for distinctions such as Ramchand's distinctions, cause, init, and result. Just to mention that, also we talked today about periphrastic passives. What seems obvious, at least by the languages that I know, whenever we have a periphrastic passive, it is syncretic, as a matter of fact, with stative. The past participle, at least, is syncretic between an event reading and the stative reading, the basic being maybe the stative reading, and then we add something like a causative little v realized as an auxiliary, but there are many possibilities. But so, okay, so this would be, yeah, so the idea, my question is, would it be more interesting to be more descriptive, but industrially descriptive as trying to distinguish between little v's and then see how little v's connect with what we want to call voice, because finally it's different to talk about voice marking, because if we think of minus actives, non-actives in Greek, for instance, they are syncretic, as Artemis mentioned, and we all know. Being syncretic, what this simply means is that the form itself does not say the whole story about the voice phenomena, right? We need to distinguish reflexive meanings from anti-causative meanings, from passive meanings. How do we do that? Probably by the syntax, because morphology is the same, but syntax is different. Finally, if we, again, then we turn to labels, which we saw today. I don't remember what there was. Artemis, I think, who mentioned a differentiation between voice agent, voice holder, and voice cause. It was on one slide. I don't know whose slide that was. When we look at this, it's heterogeneous. We, on the one hand, have something that probably we would want to say that introduces the agent. Holder, probably we don't want to say that voice introduces
can I just,
okay.
For the interest of
yes,
time, because there's
well,
other people
I
also
was
asking
a bit long, but I still want to say that case constraints are important for voice phenomena, and they were not touched upon today. And also that again, we talk about passive, a voice passive that would be uniform, or just one definition of voice passive. If we just think about passives or synthetic passive versus analytic passives, we cannot use the same if we want to capture differences like Raposo and Uriah-Guerrica's constraints on the projection of the theme with passives, which is there for copula passives, etc. Okay, I'm sorry I was so long, but it's a very complex thing.
Yeah, clearly. I'll try to address all of the points if I remember them in the right order. Yeah, to begin with the last point, yes, analytic and synthetic will not be the same kind of syntactic structure. So we wouldn't want to have the same analysis for the synthetic passive as for the analytic passive. Now, with respect to your main question and concern about voice and little v, I think the arguments that were brought in the literature had to do with the observation that you can combine typically little v related morphology like causation morphology or encoding morphology with voice morphology. So the morphology gave you hint or clues to split these two heads apart, at least in some languages. The claim, and I had a remark about the voice bundling hypothesis, is not that this is so in all languages. And then you expect, depending as to whether or not voice and little v are one head or they're two heads, people have identified distinct behavior for the configurations. But more importantly, at least for Greek, you have anti-causatives that in standard minimalism, and accusatives will not have the specifier of v, but then they surface with this morphology. So either you make the claim that all the morphology is in little v, and somehow when more than one affix occurs, you have to organize them, or you say, okay, we have voice as a morphological category, as you correctly pointed out, and there is voice, the syntactic category, and we're trying to identify the relationship between the morphology and the syntactic category. And in some languages, we have the evidence that this voice head is something different, and this is the where the morphology is there, you know, and it's there independently of whether you have a passive or reflexive or an anti-causative. It's the same morphology that you have.
What do you mean by voice when it is up a little v? You mean something that that adds the external argument, right?
No, I think, I mean, the data we had from Greek, where you have verbalizing morphology, and then when you see where the passive attaches, the affix attaches outside of this, and Heidi Harley had lots of data from Hyaki, where you basically see that, you know, there is voice morphology that goes on top of that, and other people had other similar data from other languages, where you see that you get this hierarchy, that voice is somehow outside of whatever you want to call little v morphology. Right, I think I leave it at that, because yeah.
Adriana, I don't know if you want to address.
Just answer very quickly. I think that in the way I tried to address the first question, there was essentially the point of view that Carmen was trying to make explicit, namely, maybe we are calling with the same name different things, and that for something that is related to theta assignment, maybe little v would, I'm using her words, would suffice. I mean, would be, whereas something that affects the organization of the arguments or other parts of the structure, maybe the voice term will be more adequate, or more, I mean, would make a distinction of these two different things. So in that respect, I agree entirely, and that was a bit the spirit I tried to evoke in the presentation.
Thank you. Perfect. Now we can move to the next question, which is by Guglielmo Cinque.
Well, thank you for the nice presentation. And I was wondering what you think of the possibility that there is actually more than one voice projection located at different heights in the glossal spine. I mean, Adriana mentioned causative voice, but even passive or passive-like voices seem to be more than one. If you take Romance languages, the passive morphology seems to be limited to transitive verbs. So we can say he was invited, but not it was danced or it was worked and so on. And it seems to be a very low kind of, as Adriana again suggested, projection, because it's above the lowest restructuring verbs, as we see from long passivization, where you can say in Italian or Spanish, I refer Einstein and Perlmutter's work, these houses were finished building yesterday, or were began building yesterday. Or motion verbs. Again, only the lower. You cannot say in Romance, they were tried to build, they were dared to build. However, if you take German, which allows the passive morphology to also apply to intransitive verbs, then you'll see that you can have more restructuring verbs and more long passivization. So you can say, actually, they were tried to with versuchen or dare and so on, which suggests that that kind of voice head or voice projection is higher up, higher than certain other restructuring heads. And I mean, we see the same with Italian, if you take the corresponding with the C construction, where you can have then long passivization with C, but not with the ordinary. And so, I mean, the work by Hinterholz and Wurmbrand showed that actually in German you can have these long classifications that in Italian can only be found with the C construction. And then the next thing is middle voice, which seems to be, again, different, perhaps, again, above many it seems, many restructuring predicates. And then also possibly another higher one, where in languages like Latin or Turkish, where passive morphology, now again distinguishing morphology from voice projections, you can apply them to inaccusatives, which is like having, again, an impersonal kind of interpretation. So I was wondering whether a cartographic analysis of voice heads or voice projection could be entertained, so to speak. Thank you.
Well, may I say just one comment? That's very interesting. I think that that's certainly on the right track. I mean, it was a bit in the spirit of also the way I kind of see it. Of course, I only touch upon a few cases. Now, while you were talking, you started with the passive, like the passive of anergatives, which is possible in some languages, not in others, and so on. And while you were talking, I thought that why shouldn't that be possible? If you think of it in terms of the smuggling analysis, which is in fact a derivation of passive in two steps. One part is the movement of the chunk, and the other part is the extraction of it's the promotion, say, of the internal argument into subject position. So, but these are two logically independent steps. So the passive of the anergatives would be only the movement of the chunk part of the story, and this makes sense to me. I mean, that this happens. Okay, so that was just a comment. It's a bit like the idea that in the causatives you have this chunk moving, but not necessarily an abstraction. So it looks a bit the same. And then it could be that in this case the target is a higher voice, as you were suggesting. So that's interesting.
Yes, I mean, I also find the idea interesting. In principle, I mean, some of the configurations you mentioned have naturally alternative analysis, and Julie, I think, who's here still, has proposed different feature combinations on voice heads that could, you know, take care of some of your configurations. In principle, the idea that there could be more than one head, I don't know if you want to call it voice or head that introducing or being related to the external argument is interesting. Also from the perspective of, you know, the third question that I originally was the third question, but now then it wasn't, in relationship to aspect, the relationship between voice and aspect, where you have cases where people have argued that something like aspect seems to be responsible also for introducing external arguments, because you have splits involving aspectual categories. So it might be that from a cross-linguistic perspective, there could be more than one voice head, but maybe it's not really voice. Maybe, you know, it's voice in one case, is aspect in another case. And that would be in line with the cartographic approach. Also, it might very well be that in languages like German, it is the auxiliary that does the work that in the passive, that in other languages, the voice morphology does. So once you start looking at this configuration from the cross-linguistic perspective, maybe other differences will emerge.
Thank you. Perfect. And now we have our last question for this evening, which is by William Snyder, if you want.
Thank you. And I'll try to make it quick. I wanted to invite Adriana especially to comment on the following. So I was glad that Adriana brought in some acquisition data, and I wanted to bring up a point where I think there's an especially strong possibility of bringing together the kinds of syntactic research being described in this flash mob event with child language research. So I'm thinking in particular about the timing of child language acquisition with respect to different kinds of passive on the one hand and different kinds of causative on the other. So in work with Nina Hyams, I have explored the idea that certain kinds of, reflexive clitic constructions can be mastered by children very early, verbal B passives in English very late. We've also looked though, so back up a little bit, Teresa Guasti has called attention to the fact that children acquiring English get passives, or often can do certain types of get passives very early, verbal B passives much later. And she conjectured that in French, for example, the faire part causatives should pattern with get passives and the faire a with the verbal B passives. And in work with Jason Borga, we found that was precisely correct for children acquiring French, that the faire part was showing up before the third birthday. Also, se faire in these sort of get passive like meanings. And actually the faire part seemed to be more like the had something done kind of construction in English. And but the faire a itself seems to be much later. So I'm wondering just what your thoughts are on this possibility that we can use acquisition data. Actually, the one other element I wanted to mention was just the idea that smuggling is the problem. That the cases where the child actually, or adult, has to perform a smuggling derivation, we get the delay until around the age of 4 at least. And then that correlates with the presence or absence of the necessity or not of a syntactically realized external argument. That's what's going to force the smuggling. So if you can do a get passive without that, or for external argument being required, you don't need the smuggling and kids can do it early. So I wonder what your reactions though are. Is this crazy?
No, absolutely. That's right. I mean, it has to be right that there is an order. And well, you asked several questions. Some would need maybe longer answers. Let me just give some quick shots, so to speak. As for the timing, so the timing, that's very interesting because in a way, and this is what I said in the quick presentations before, we see the causative passive early. So I even said a kind of preferred type of passive because it's something that sounds passive to us, okay? So it's a causative passive. However, and clearly it's preferred in the elicited production data that I was referring to the copular and also to the venire passive, which is also early acquired before the copular. Okay, anyway, that's all. Another story. However, this is something. This type of passive is not. It's the first one that sounds passive to us, but children, we have interesting data of answers to the same eliciting question by the younger groups, in which, and this is consistent with your point, in which they rather use reflexive, as Artemis was reminding us at the beginning. We know that reflexive is in fact a morphology that it's often used cross-linguistically. It's often found cross-linguistically as a passive, say, morphology. So that's actually the idea I have also explored, of saying that maybe the reflexive is a kind of there is a stage, an early stage of a reflexive passive as a route to passive, and maybe precisely because the reflexive picks up the external argument position, and so you have no intervention problem, and no smuggling is necessarily implied, because smuggling, it's maybe not that complex as we see from the causative views, but clearly it's more complex than direct movement. So that's a very long story, very short. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, just I will make a remark because I mean an alternative, at least for the get passive, and maybe for the C passive, depending on what you think the building blocks are, is that the get passive is a smaller structure than the B passive, and I think Ken Wexler in some of his work has suggested that the children begin with the resultative and then they move on to the full verbal passive. So this is an alternative that it has to do with, you know, we begin with smaller structures and then we expand. And this is a slightly different perspective from the one Adriana highlighted.
Not that different.
No, not that different. But
the causative is a
Yeah.
smaller structure than a
Yeah.
full complementation.
Yeah,
So,
this is why I said slightly different.
yeah.
If you could see a way that you make different acquisitional predictions for those two different views, I would love to test them. So please let me know.
Yeah, if Teresa was to hear, this is something that we're kind of working on.
Really excellent. No, I'll very much look forward to what you find. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And I want to thank the speakers for this amazing discussion. And I would like now to pass, I think Cecilia has something to add at the end. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, for making the discussion so exciting. As usual, you see our organizational group and also, you know, in the next slide, the scientific committee that, you know, has been organizing all these flash mobs. Our next flash mob will be on the 17th of June, and it will be on heritage language. So please mark this down in your calendar and see you in about a month. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.